Here are some questions on fiscal policy.
Here's an awesome test question which really covers everything. The government has determined that the Canadian economy is underproducing. What can they do to speed up economic growth? And explain your answer. There's going to be a bunch of questions that follow up. We're going to do that in the later slides, but let's do the explanation part here. So what you need to understand here is the idea of underproducing. What does underproducing mean? It means that our actual production is below potential, which means a recessionary gap. Now, if you have a recessionary gap, how do you close it? What can the government do? Well, there are two options. One of them is to increase their purchases or to lower the taxes. So the G goes up or T goes down, and that would be called expansionary fiscal policy. All right. Because of the lower taxes, the households would be able to purchase more goods and services, and that would be because of the disposable income.
All right, so let's take what we just saw on the previous slide and actually answer the individual questions. So if we want to draw the current state of the economy using the ADAS model, all we're really doing is drawing a recessionary gap. Okay, so we draw the GDP market, ADAS, the original equilibrium, and then we want to show that the actual level of GDP, which is right here, Y1, it's good to write it underneath so we keep track of things, should be below the potential. So the potential GDP, which you can label Y star, QP, keep the notation that your teacher tells you, okay, but it all means the same thing. What we're saying is the economy is in a recessionary gap, which would look something like this. So there's the potential. This curve is labeled LRAS here, but again, notation can change, okay, it represents the long run supply of the economy. Next, we're asked to draw the effect of the government's action that was suggested. So we had suggested expansionary fiscal policy, which would stimulate people's consumption by giving them more disposable income. And that's just going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, hopefully enough so that it lands exactly on the long-run equilibrium and eliminates the recessionary gap entirely. What happened to the price level in the economy? Well, if we compare the two price levels, we see that it increased. What happened to the real GDP in the economy? Well, if we compare the two real GDPs, the real GDP increased, which was the goal. If we want to get out of a recession, we want to stimulate GDP by getting people to spend more money.
So you're asked to use the ADAS model to show what happens when government purchases go down, right? So you start with your GDP market with ADAS, just like always, and the equilibrium level. When the government purchases go down, it means less G, and that's part of our aggregate expenditure formula. So lower G means lower aggregate expenditure. That is less spending on the economy's goods and services, and that means lower demand for Canadian products. So the demand curve is going to shift to the left. Draw arrows to the left and draw a new curve, AD2. Find your new equilibrium and the corresponding price and GDP. If you compare the prices and the GDP, you're going to see that both of them are going down. So the equilibrium price level goes down, the equilibrium GDP also goes down. And the name of this policy is contractionary fiscal policy.
So here's another version of the same question. So here the policy we're talking about is lowering income taxes. So we start by just drawing the GDP market, and then we think about how does lower income taxes affect spending in the economy? Well, households will have more disposable income. If we're taxing people less, then they should have more money left over at their disposal. Okay, so you can use this formula if you recognize it. Okay, if you don't, then you can just explain it in your own words. But how does more disposable income affect consumption? Well, it will increase consumption. Once again, another formula here. If you recognize it, you can use it. If not, just explain in your own words. But when people have more disposable income, they consume more and they save more. The key here is that they're consuming more. Because if people are consuming more, then we think of our aggregate expenditure formula. If this consumption portion here goes up, then aggregate demand is actually increasing. Okay, so here is a quick way of explaining this, just with symbols. If there are less taxes to pay, disposable income goes up, consumption goes up, expenditures go up, which leads to increased aggregate demand. And then we can shift the AD curve to the right. We label the new equilibrium, new GDP, new price level, and we conclude that the equilibrium price and equilibrium GDP increased. What is the name of this type of policy? Well, because it's stimulating demand and because it's the government who's implementing the policy, it's expansionary fiscal policy.